Days after the attacks, a series of letters were mailed to ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Post, and the National Enquirer in Florida that had traces of anthrax in them. Robert Stevens, who worked at the Enquirer, had died from the effects on October 5th, 2001, 4 days after being admitted to the hospital, complaining about wheezing, lesions on his legs and arms, in which the anthrax that was responsible, that was found in these letters, appeared to have a clumped brown granular material which looked like dog food. Two more letters bearing the same Trenton, New Jersey postmark as the others, dated October 9th, were mailed 3 weeks after the first series of letters, and they were mailed to two Democratic senators, and Tom Daschle from South Dakota and Patrick Leahy from Vermont. Leahy was the Senate Majority Leader, and Leahy was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Leahy was also a major opponent against the Iraq resolution, incidentally. The Daschle letter was opened by an aide, and an aide's name was Grant Leslie. And on October 15th, the government mail service was shut down. The unopened Leahy letter was discovered in an unimpounded mailbag on November 16th. In total, at least 16 people, at least 22 people developed anthrax infections, and 11 of them contracted the life-threatening inhalational variety, in which it was called inhalational anthrax, which was the far more potent of the two different kinds of anthrax that was sent. And 5 died, and they were from the inhalational anthrax. The letters contained messages to which the first series of letters went like this, to the Post and NBC, ABC, and CBS, and which was dated 9/11/01. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The second series of letters to Leahy and Daschle went like this. 9/11-01. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. And all the letters were copies made from a copy machine. The originals were never found, and the return addresses were fictitious addresses. There was no return address. Immediately after this, there were many false leads attached to these incidents, and one of them was from a hoax letter mailed to St. Petersburg, Florida, which thought to have anthrax in them. A copycat hoax letter contained this harmless white powder that was mailed to Judith Miller of the New York Times. And almost on the day of the attacks, the anthrax attacks, the next day, FBI Director Robert Mueller had blamed Al-Qaeda for sending these letters with the anthrax material. And during the presidential morning briefings, he was actually criticized harshly for not providing evidence that the manipulated spores were from bin Laden's Al-Qaeda group, and that everybody who was involved with the briefing knew that Al-Qaeda couldn't make this anthrax without sophisticated machinery in a cave in Afghanistan. But some media reports, anyway, blamed Iraq for the anthrax, and that included the Wall Street Journal and the British tabloid The Guardian, in which the story would break regarding Czechoslovakian counterintelligence service claiming that Mohammed Atta, who was a part of the September 11 hijackings and allegedly the pilot for American Airlines 11, which crashed into the North Tower, had met with Ahmed Samir Alani of Iraqi intelligence, and the meeting was at a console in a cafe in Prague, Al-Ani was a consul member of the Iraqi embassy. This would later be repeated by Vice President Dick Cheney in an interview with Meet the Press on December 9, 2001, in which he says, quote, "It's been pretty well confirmed that Atta did go to Prague, and he did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service in the Czech Republic last April, 7 months before the attack," end quote. However, this meeting would later be confirmed as a false report, and that's coming from even high-level CIA officials, led by James Pavitt, the director of operations, in which he found no credible evidence for the meeting. However, that didn't suspend some officials of the 9/11 Commission, which they claimed that they could not absolutely rule out the possibility that Mohammed Atta was in Prague on April 9th, traveling under an alias. However, there was no reason for the meeting because it would pose a risk to the operation, in which all the 4 members of the pilot hijacking team already achieved their pilot's licenses. So this meeting would basically serve no purpose for the operation. Now, the source for this claim came from a contact within the Czech intelligence, which had within an operative inside the Iraqi embassy. This false information was used as a pretext to connect Al-Qaeda with Iraq, and which led to the U.S. military invasion of the country. And one of the contacts for this was Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was a Libyan national who was captured in Afghanistan in 2001, in which he was tortured mercilessly. And for him to end the torture, he gave them basically false information. One of them was that al-Libi said that he personally witnessed al-Qaeda operatives in Iraq making chemical weapons. And it was based on this information that was presented by Colin Powell at the United Nations, using the information of the Czech meeting, the Prague meeting, and al-Libi's information, and that's how they military invaded Iraq. Going back to the letters sent to the media contained a brown coarse material, while the letters sent to the senators contained a fine powder. This fine powder was the inhalahax material. The powder containing to the senators were the more fatal of the two. And this strain of anthrax that was involved with the 2 series of letters was known as the Ames strain, named after a town in Iowa. The Ames strain was a common strain isolated from a cow in Texas in 1981, and the report was mistakenly attached to this isolate, and then there was a mix-up about the mailing label and the package, and it was sent to Ames, Iowa, and that's how they got the name Ames strain. But it was first researched at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, or USA AMRID, in Fort Detrick, Maryland. The anthrax was used in the senator's letters to scientists, which was investigated by the FBI's Hazardous Materials Response Unit. And they later claimed that this strain was likely manipulated. It wasn't the general inhalahax anthrax. In fact, it contained an additional chemical, and which caused the spores in the inhalahax to ooze, whereas the anthrax spores were dry. This was a wet cutaneous anthrax. So there was an additional derivative, in which the scientists from the FBI Hazardous Material Response Unit ascertained that it most likely contained smallpox, which actually made this anthrax really lethal. After White House meeting with Mueller the next day, reporting about the manipulated halahax, media reports such as the New York Times reported, quote, containing some U.S. officials, 3 scientists call anthrax power high grade, 2 experts say anthrax was altered to produce a more deadly weapon. And the Washington Post reported that the additive made spores deadlier, end quote. And regarding this, there was a massive FBI investigation into the anthrax attacks. Meanwhile, the FBI and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, both gave permission for Iowa State University to destroy the entire Iowa anthrax archive. And that was destroyed on October 10th and 11th, 2001. Why did they do this? Why did the FBI and the CDC give permission to destroy the anthrax collection, which would have been, and according to NSAID scientists, thought it was a huge mistake in destroying this crucial piece of evidence to the investigation? Why would you destroy the whole archive? Because that's where the strain came from. It didn't come from Al-Qaeda in a cave in Afghanistan. It didn't come from a chemical bioweapons lab in Iraq. These were all false intelligence reports made by the intelligence community and covered up by the FBI. The FBI had one person of interest, however, and that was Bruce Edwards Irvings, who was a biochemical researcher at Fort Detrick for 18 years. He was their main biochemical weapons agent, in which the FBI levied huge pressure, investigative pressure in Irving's whole life, going through his background, going through his life, his current life, in which Irving suffered from depression. And he committed suicide. After this intense pressure was put on from the FBI as its main suspect. However, the information the FBI used against him was highly suspect. It was circumstantial at best. There was no evidence containing Bruce Irving's having any evidence manipulating these spores, which would have took some time to create, to manipulate the common spores of inhalahax anthrax. And so the FBI conducted this investigation in which the Senate Judiciary Committee closed the investigation and said that Irvings was primarily responsible. In fact, one of those people was Patrick Leahy. And another person was Tom Daschle. Incidentally enough, the very people who didn't want the invasion of Iraq basically claimed that Irvings was primarily responsible for manipulating the inhalahax anthrax spore. Ironically. And that information, along with other false intelligence, which led to the invasion, the U.S. military invasion of Iraq. And all this information was false later on down the road, even as far back as 2011, where it later came out that, this information was false. Oops. Over one point, approximately, it's stated through whatever report coming from the World Health Organization, Pentagon civilian casualty reports, or what have you, the dozens of reports that have come out over the years, basically differ about how many people were killed, but generally it's stated that well over 1 million people were killed in the Iraq conflict regarding 2003 and 2006. This was a huge intelligence failure. This was a huge military failure, which saw the deaths over 1 million people, and which I would submit to you that people like Dick Cheney, even George Tenet, who was behind Colin Powell at the United Nations meeting, basically feeding him the report. Everybody that was involved with the false intelligence reports regarding Al-Libi, anthrax, and the report regarding the false intelligence of Czechoslovakia regarding a connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. These people belong in The Hague. They belong to be tried for crimes against humanity, war crimes. Because that's what we would have done if we had a real investigation committee inside the United States. We do have a global war committee, but the United States is not involved with that. Well, I wonder why. And basically it's because that the United States government would basically have a number of high-level U.S. officials of the past 75 years being tried for crimes against humanity.